Hola, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos a esta nueva entrevista con los expertos de talento. En este episodio vamos a estar hablando de cómo construir equipos virtuales. Para ello, nuestro experto invitado el día de hoy es Gordy Curphy. Les platico un poco de Gordon. Gordon cuenta tanto como una maestría como con un doctorado en psicología industrial y organizacional. Como consultor ha realizado más de 1000 evaluaciones ejecutivas y ha facilitado más de 250 equipos y capacitado a más de 15,000 líderes en una amplia variedad de temas de liderazgo. Es por ello que invierte la mayor parte de su tiempo ayudando a los altos ejecutivos, C-suite y a líderes de unidad de negocio a resolver retos complejos de liderazgo. Sus esfuerzos de consultoría ayudan a desarrollar las estrategias de negocio de los líderes, a alinear la cultura de la estrategia, a implementar iniciativas de cambio mayores, a construir planes y scorecards anuales, a contratar, desarrollar y promover el liderazgo en el talento, así como construir equipos de alto desempeño en líderes senior. También nos acompaña Victoria Zapata. Victoria es nuestra directora general en HR Tools y guiará la conversación con Gordon. Victoria cuenta con más de 35 años de experiencia en recursos humanos y ha sido directora de capital humano de grandes empresas, y en el año del 2004 fue que fundó nuestra firma HR Tools. Al finalizar vamos a dar tiempo para tus preguntas hacia Gordy Curphy. Las pueden poner en el Q&A, en la sección de Q&A del seminario, y las vamos a responder al final de la entrevista. Como saben, esta entrevista va a ser en inglés. Si gustan poner y no va a haber traducción simultánea, entonces si gustan poner sus preguntas en inglés o ya sea en español y yo las traduzco. Deseamos que esta conversación te deje nuevas experiencias, aprendizajes y buenas prácticas, y que disfruten esta plática con una buena taza de café. Muy bien, pues Vicky, Gordon, bienvenidos. Vicky, te cedo la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Chio. Buenos días a todos. Qué padre estar aquí con ustedes. Hi, Gordy. I'm so happy to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me. I want to thank all the folks at HR Tools, you and Rocio and everybody else to help put this on, as well as all the participants for attending this session.
Yes, thank you. And I really thank the people that joined us this morning. I hope you're going to have a good time with us. And well, let's start. Gordy, you have so many years doing this and teams and leadership and research and everything. You're so active. I think your military history has something to do with it, but because you are so always active, no? So I'm so happy to have you here. But the thing is that I would like to understand if you can share something with us. How did you start doing this research life path?
I'll share two stories. One is just in terms of getting interested in research in general. For one time, I was actually a tenured professor. I taught leadership at the Air Force Academy and got my PhD in industrial organizational psychology from the University of Minnesota. And my dissertation was on leadership. And I think between being a college professor and getting my PhD, it kept me interested in research, and I continue to do research today. But with respect to my interest in teams, that's kind of an interesting story, because I used to run a consulting shop that had about 80 PhD and master's levels people in it. So we used to do about 1,000 leadership assessments a year. We'd have 1,000 directors, vice presidents, CEOs come through for anywhere from a 1 to 2 day, very intensive leadership assessment that I know HR Tools does a lot of that work. We were doing that also. And we got hired by a financial services firm to help them identify high potential talent. So these were people typically mid-career, 35 to 40 years old, sort of director level folks. They were seen in the organization as some of the best and brightest people in the company, and they wanted us to do formal assessments on these individuals because they wanted to see whether or not, one, they were high potentials, and two, that they were going to put them through a 1-year-long high potential development program and then place them into roles leading teams critical to strategy execution. So we ended up putting them through a very rigorous 1.5 day process involving personality testing, mental ability testing, 4 or 5 different business simulations, 360s. And by and large, those results showed these folks were some of the best and brightest people in the company. They were really good. We work with them over the course of a year to develop their skills, teach them a bunch of things about what it would take to be a good leader. And then they went off and were placed into these roles across the company, across the globe, where they were very critical to strategy execution. They were running teams, they were running organizations that were critical to the organization achieving its financial goals. Well, 3 years later, we went back to see, okay, so what happened with these individuals? How did they do? There were about 15 or 20 people in the study. We said, okay, so what happened with these teams? What happened with these individuals? And the research showed that about a third of these people did really well. They were able to build loyal followings. They were able to get people to work together, and they were able to achieve the results that the team was assigned to do. Another 1/3 were just mixed. They hit some of their objectives they missed. The teams were not what we would call hitting on all cylinders. They weren't really high performing teams, but they were just sort of middling along. And then about a third were outright failures. So these teams did not produce. They never achieved their objectives, even though the person leading it was one of the best and brightest people in the company. And so I started to look at this and say, okay, so what is going on here? We know that these people have the right personalities. They have the right mental abilities. They're all really smart. They had all gone to the right schools. We've taught them all these skills. How did 2/3 of these teams did not do that well? And what we came to the conclusion was that the ability to build teams was a key differentiator. It was the key differentiator. Those people who were very successful were able to build loyal followings and build high-performing teams that got results. The other 2 groups of people did not succeed in terms of building teams. And what was really interesting is when we went through the selection process to identify these people, and as we looked at the curriculum we used to develop these people, we never looked at their ability to build teams. They all took stress well. They are all ambitious. They all had great interpersonal skills. They all, had gone to the right schools. They were all really bright, but we never looked at whether or not they could build teams, and we never taught them how to build teams. And then we put them in roles to where, okay, now you got to build a team. You can't just rely on your own skills to get things done. You've got to get stuff done through other people. You got to get these people working effectively together to accomplish your objectives. And 2/3 of them really struggled with that. So that got us interested in teams. Like, okay, so there's something up with this, what we're using now to measure leadership in terms of personality, mental abilities, business simulations, 360s. What we're using now does not assess whether a person can build a team. So we need to come up with some more direct ways to do that, because to us, leadership is a team sport. It usually involves teams. And so we need to start getting a better handle on what it takes to build a high-performing team and identify and train people on how to build high-performing teams.
I think there is a trend about thinking that groups are not as good as teams. Or maybe when sometimes someone is talking about their group or their team, they say, we are a team, we are not a group. Can you share something about it to us, please?
Yeah, sure. And what I'm going to do here, Victoria, I'm going to share my screen, because I'm going to give you a couple of graphics here that might be helpful in terms of illuminating what we're going to be talking about here. So, all right. Well, you make a very important distinction, Victoria, and I'm glad you asked this question, because there is a lot of confusion about groups and teams. Basically, groups and teams are 2 different ways we can organize work. 2 different ways we can get things done. So let me define what a group looks like. So in a group, you've got people with individual goals. Those folks in a group do not really interact with each other, or they do not affect each other. And people in a group get incented or rewarded based upon their individual results. Here was my goal, here was my objective, here's what I got done, here's how I get bonus, or here's how I get compensated based upon my individual accomplishments. If you think about a golf team, like, we've got Lorena Ochoa here. So we think about a golf team. The folks on a golf team all have individual goals. They want to shoot the lowest score possible. What one golfer does doesn't really affect anybody else. And at the end of the match, they're going to get rewarded based upon the scores that they shoot. You can think about swimming teams and track teams also being groups. Same sort of deal. Everybody's got their own events that they're swimming or they're running. What one person does has very little impact on anybody else, unless they happen to be in a relay. But in most of the events, they're running very separately, and they win or lose their individual meets. Sales teams and talent acquisition teams are very much groups. If you think about most sales teams, the account representatives have their own goals. They have their own clients that they're going to go after, their own territories that they manage. What one salesperson has very little impact on anybody else. And at the end of the year or at the end of the quarter, they get bonused based upon their individual accomplishments. Same thing with recruiting. Same thing with talent acquisition. Many times people working in talent acquisition have their own positions they're trying to fill. What one person does doesn't affect anybody else. And they get compensated and rewarded based upon the number of positions they fill on a timely basis. This is a very good way of organizing work. This can be a very effective way of organizing work. It depends on the nature of the work and the task that has to be accomplished. So groups work really well in certain environments, like in sales, like in recruiting. That is very different than a team. So a team would be like retos here. If you think about a soccer team or a volleyball team or a basketball team, there is a common goal. There's not individual goals, there's a common goal. The goal is to win the game. What one person does on the field or on the pitch or on the court affects everybody else. If you were a soccer team and the goalie decides to leave the game, it affects everybody else. It's not going to work very well. And at the end of the game, the team wins or loses collectively. It does not matter if somebody scored 5 goals during the game. If the team loses 6-5, the team still loses. That's a team. So a team has common goals. They have what we call interdependent effort. What one person does affects everybody else. And they win or lose together. They have a common fate. Now, most teams that we see in organizations, or most collections of people we see in organizations, are typically a hybrid. They have some elements of group and some elements of team to them. All right. And what's very important for teams to understand, particularly so C-suite teams. So if you're talking about teams at the top of the organization, what's very important for teams to differentiate is when they need to operate as a team. So these are the issues where we all have to work together as a team in order to achieve certain outcomes. And these are the issues where it's actually better to work as a group. It's better to give this individual assignment to Rocio and let her handle this herself, or Victoria, or to Gordy. We don't all have to be involved with these topics, because if we get involved with these topics that are more group topics, it actually gets in the way. We end up spending a lot of time talking about things that aren't particularly relevant to everybody else on the team. And many people start, checking out because it's a waste of their time. They don't need to be involved with these issues. Let's just give it to Victoria. So most collections of people are what we call hybrids. They operate somewhere between a group and a team. They have group characteristics, they have team characteristics, and what's really important is to establish the ground rules about, okay, here are the topics where we operate as a team. Here are the ones that we operate as a group. Again, one of these is not better than the other. But what you need to do as a leader, here's real critical. As a leader, you need to recognize where your people are at and then lead them accordingly. For example, if I'm leading a group, if I have a bunch of sales representatives working for me, or a bunch of talent acquisition specialists, a bunch of recruiters, I can spend a lot of time on team building activities, getting them to work as a team. We need to be a team. And if I'm your best salesperson, I'm going to find all those team building activities to be a complete waste of time. Because I'd rather be out there making money. I'd rather be out there talking to clients. All this stuff we're doing around team building kind of gets in the way of me getting the job done. On the other hand, so this is an example where a leader is treating a group like a team. I've got a group and I want them to be a team. And it's just going to end up wasting a lot of people's time. People are going to get disengaged, and some people will probably end up leaving. The opposite can also happen. I can have a team where the leader treats it as a group. And when that happens, the leader ends up being the coordinating mechanism between all the people on the team. So if Victoria is the team leader and she's got 8 people working for her, she doesn't really let the 8 people talk to each other to work things out and get things done. She gets in the middle and says, okay, you talk to me and then I'll talk to Rocio. Rocio says, here's this, and then it goes to Alexandra. The leader plays the middle in this sort of situation and actually gets in the way, gums up the works. He or she prevents the team from working a lot faster than it could. I remember working with a $1 billion US company. It was a retail organization that made cooking. They built everything in for a kitchen. Well-known company in the United States. And it was very much a team that operated this business, and the leader treated it like a group. So he had to make every single decision for the team. He had to get involved with every single decision. He had to be in the middle of every single thing. And the team really struggled because the leader was not treating the team in the right way. He was trying to manage it as a group when it really should have been managed as a team.
What about now that we have changed like this virtual thing, how do these affect this either teams or groups, or how do you see the influence?
The pandemic's been really interesting on that. I'm glad you asked that question, Victoria. So here's what's really interesting. If you think about a group, groups, have each person on a group has an individual goal. What they do doesn't affect anybody else, and they get rewarded or punished based upon their individual results. The pandemic didn't affect them very much. They didn't have to coordinate with other people. They didn't have to check in with other people. So they may be working remotely versus out of an office before, but by and large, they didn't get affected all that much. Teams, on the other hand, got affected by the pandemic greatly because teams take a lot more work than groups, actually. Teams, we have to make sure, does everybody understand what the common goal is? Does everybody understand how we're measuring success? Does everybody have clear roles and responsibilities? Are we having good work handoffs? Are we solving conflicts on the team? Do we have the necessary resources to get everything done? So the pandemic and the lockdowns and working remotely had a much, much bigger impact on teams than it had on groups.
How does a high-performing team looks like?
Yeah.
Or how does the performance of those successful teams look like?
Here's the difficult part for many people. So if you ask 20 people how to build a high-performing team, you'll probably get 20 different answers. Everybody's got a different opinion about how to build a team. And some of those answers end up being pretty good, and some of those answers end up being pretty bad. And over the last 25 years, we've been working on a model and validating and doing the research with our model on, well, here's the things you really have to pay attention to if you want to build a high-performing team. And so here's our model. Our model's called the Rocket Model. It's got 8 different components, and it just says, look, if you want to build a high-performing team, here are the things you have to pay attention to in order to make that happen. So I'm just going to walk from the bottom of the model up and just do a quick explanation of the different components of the model. So the first component is context. If you want to build a high-performing team, you got to ensure that everybody's on the same page about the situation. Everybody has the same understanding about customers and what they're going to do over the next 6 months that could affect the team. competitors, regulators, market conditions, medical conditions like lockdown. Are we getting off lockdown? What is the situation surrounding the team? And with virtual teams, it can be very difficult because people are working remotely, so that the amount of coordination to make sure everybody's on the same page about the situation facing the team can be difficult to get common alignment and to share a common understanding about these are the biggest challenges facing the team right now. So context is about getting alignment around the situation, because the situation has a big impact on how the team operates and performs. Then the next two components we talk about are mission and talent. Mission is, what's the purpose of the team? Why does the team exist? What does the team need to accomplish in order to be successful? What are its goals? And how is it going to get those goals accomplished? What are the strategies and plans it needs to put in place in order to make that happen? So it's all, mission's all about the why, the what, and the how. This is why we exist. This is what we need to accomplish. This is how we're going to measure success. This is how we're going to get it done. Talent has to do with who's on the team. And that should be driven by mission. Depending upon why the team exists, what you need to accomplish, these are the kinds of people you need on the team. This is how many people you have. This is the kind of skills you need. This is the kind of roles they need to play. This is the kind of leadership and followership, more importantly, we need. So talent is all about the people on the team. And what's really important is that we look at what the team's trying to accomplish and then populate the team with the right people. Many times it happens the other way around. Oh, I've got all these people over here. Now let's try to figure out what they should do. Typically doesn't work. All right. But with virtual teams, it's really important to get the talent piece right, because particularly around roles and responsibilities, who is doing what? Then we go up to the next stage of the model. We talk about norms and buy-in. So norms are the unwritten rules in which teams get things done. How do they run their meetings? How do they make decisions? What are the rules around communication and accountability? Virtual teams really struggle with this because a lot of team meetings can be wasted. Everybody's suffering from Zoom fatigue, and a lot of those Zoom meetings are not run really well. So this has to do with, how do we make meetings more efficient and effective? How do we make sure the right decision-making processes are in place, particularly with a virtual team, so everybody understands who's involved with what decisions, who's making what calls? Also, it's around accountability. Let's make sure things that are supposed to get done are getting done. Here's the rules around accountability and making sure things happen. Buy-in has to do with it's the motivational component of the rocket model. Is there enough motivation on the team to accomplish its goals? And with virtual teams, sometimes there's not. People don't have the buy-in to the goals. They say, I really don't want to get involved with that, or I really don't want to do these tasks I've been assigned. This happens a lot. Buy-in is a real big problem with matrix teams, because with a matrix team, if you think about it, people have divided loyalties. Is there loyalty to this team, or their loyalty to some other team? And so buy-in can be a problem, particularly for matrix teams. Then we've got resources and courage. Resources has to do with the budget, the authority, the equipment. Teams need to be successful. And this was a big problem early on with virtual teams. Yeah, a lot of times they didn't have the computers, or they didn't have the telecom or the Wi-Fi bandwidth in order for the team to work together. That's what this component's all about. Courage is all about it's the psychological safety factor. Is there trust on this team, and are teams having robust conversations about where it needs to go and how it's actually performing? Can people speak truth to power? Can people challenge each other to come up with better solutions? Our line here is, polite teams get polite results. High-performing teams typically have pretty lively debates. They have lively debates, and that's okay, as long as the debate's about the problem, about potential solutions or processes to be used. It's not about the people in the room. And then the last component is results. Is the team winning? Is the team having an impact? Is it accomplishing its goals? Is the team getting better over time? That's the 8 components of the rocket model. And so if you're trying to build a high-performing team, you've got to attend to these eight components. You've got to pay attention to them. And we like this model because it works for just about any kind of team or group. You know, it works with new teams, it works with C-suite teams, it works with first-line supervisor teams, works with HR teams, works with product development teams. You name the team, the model works and will probably identify 95 to 100% of the problems that occur on teams.
That's amazing. I love this model because it seems that it has like a lot of structure. It doesn't take you like to a good relationship only, because most of the times when we work with teams, the expectation is that like we're gonna get along, and well, that's good to have, but it's not gonna be something that will help them really to perform, no? Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a better relationship, but so what, no? How have you seen the engagement of the people using this model?
Yeah. So the model works really well. Once people understand the model, and my hunch is if you think about for any of our audience, if they're on a team right now, my hunch is you could use this model just by yourself to figure out what the team is doing well and not so well. You know, is everybody on the same page about the situation facing the team? Does your team have clear goals? And do you have a clear strategies and plans for accomplishing these goals? Does the team have the right people on it? My hunch is if you think about the problems that are affecting your team right now, they fall into one or more of these buckets of the rocket model. Now let's talk about how we use the rocket model. We use the rocket model across a broad variety of situations. So not only we're going to talk about it in terms of like team engagements, so working with an individual team, and I'm going to explain what that looks like here in just a minute, but we also use the rocket model in onboarding, because a lot of times we will have new executives join a firm and we'll have the team that they're inheriting take one of our surveys, so he or she knows, okay, what kind of team am I inheriting? Is this a high performing team? Is this a low performing team? Is this a team that needs help or doesn't need help? And so the new team leader can come in and say, okay, here's the kind of team I'm taking over. We use it in leadership development programs to help leaders learn the blocking and tackling skills needed to build high performing teams. We use the model in formal leadership assessment batteries. I'll go over to the assessment in a minute, but many times when we assess C-suite leaders or vice presidents and above, and we do a lot of that work still, we always use the rocket model and it's a corresponding team assessment survey for internal candidates in order to get at that team building piece that we talked about earlier when I talked about the high potential program. Let's talk about a team engagement we did recently. This is with a fintech company based here in the United States. So it was a brand new startup. It was one of these Silicon Valley sort of startup companies. It was actually based in the middle of the United States, but it was a 4-year-old company. It just got acquired for $800 million. So it was one of these things that, you know, where they started up, put a bunch of money on to grow, and they tried to get it bought, and that's exactly what happened. So they were highly, highly successful. The team consists of CEO and 8 people on their executive leadership team, their top team. And there was a lot of problems on this team. So we did this survey about a year ago. And let me just describe a little bit of what was going on. So this page comes from our team assessment survey. The team assessment survey is an online instrument. It takes about 15 minutes to complete. We now have the Spanish version ready to go, thanks to Victoria Rocio and the team. And what it does is it provides teams with feedback, benchmarking feedback about what it's doing well and not so well about the rocket, given the rocket model. And we really like this because when we try to do team building or team engagements, we like using data to figure out what we should do. You know, most of the time when people do team engagement, they don't have any data to work with. They're just saying, okay, I think we should do this exercise. I think this activity would be good, or this thing would be fun. But many of those activities don't really have any relationship to what the team is struggling with or what it needs to do to operate at a higher level. So you can see here are the 8 components of the rocket model listed on your left. You can see these scores. They range from 16 to 54. On a team assessment scores, a team assessment survey, scores range from 0 to 100. So scores range from 0 to 100, 50 being on par. In this case, 50 would be the same sort of score we would expect from another C-suite team. So having a score of 50 says you're about the same as other C-suite teams that have taken the survey. Lower scores indicate lower performance. You're not as good as other C-suite teams that have taken the survey. Higher scores are associated with teams that are more high performing. Now, high performing C-suite teams typically have scores of 75 or above. And they would have 75s or higher across all 8 categories. And I just did 2 team assessment surveys last week for 2 CEO succession candidates. One was a chief technology officer for an engineering firm. The other one's for a physical fitness firm, run fitness centers. Both of them had scores above 75 across all these categories. So both of them had done a very good job building their teams underneath them. But what you see here is this C-suite team is not operating real well. It's really struggling because a lot of these scores are low. We've only got 2 scores of norms and results that are sort of average. And I guess resources are just a little bit below average. The rest are quite a bit lower. And a lot of this had to do with some new people coming on the team. And so there was a lot of disagreement about what the situation was. That's why the context score was so low. There was not agreement about what the challenges were facing the team, what they thought customers and investors and regulators were going to be doing over the next year. There was not as much agreement as they thought about what the circumstances were, what the situation was affecting the team. The team also needed to clean up its mission. Some of its goals were not very well measured or articulated, and they needed to tighten that up. Talent was actually their biggest problem. There was an individual on this team who was the head of IT. Now, this is a financial tech company. So IT was the biggest part of the organization. So out of 700 people in the company, 400 were in IT. So he had by far the biggest organization. He was a jerk. He didn't get along with anybody. He had his own thing going on. He was building his own platform behind the scenes. He was not following up on any of the CEO's directives. None of his peers liked him. None of those peers trusted him. And I finally convinced the CEO to fire this guy. It took a long time, but I said, this is what your problem is. You got a bad egg on this team. You got a guy who doesn't play nice with anybody else, and it's affecting everything else. Look, if you look at the buy-in score, this is why the buy-in score was so low. Nobody trusted this guy. Nobody thought we could get there given what he was doing in IT. And you can see, nobody, there was no debates. Nobody challenged him in public. This is the courage component. So this bad person was really affecting everybody else on the team, and that was really a big problem. Now, they had to do some other things. Their meetings need to be a bit better, which is the norms piece. Their meetings and decision-making had to be cleared up. They need to do a better job starting to learn how to challenge each other and confront each other appropriately. But the biggest problem was the fact that they had an individual on the team that was just toxic, and they needed to get rid of him. And once they got rid of this individual and replaced him with somebody else, we ended up then doing a 2-day offsite with the team to address these different issues. So we worked through what the context piece needed to look like to get everybody on the same page. We cleaned up their mission components. So everybody was clear about the purpose of the ELT and set a very clear set of team goals. So they had a nice team scorecard that they could track and measure. Roles and responsibilities were clarified with the new IT person coming in. Let's make sure who is doing what, and they had the right people on the team now with the right skills. We did clean up how they ran their meetings and their decision-making process. So we used data to help drive, here's the activities we need to do, and here's the sequence of activities we need to have in order to help this team operate at a much higher level. And that's pretty typical of the kinds of things we do with teams.
That's amazing. And I love the way you mix the leadership thing and the the rocket model and how do they mix all together? Because it seemed to me like something is sometimes is like, okay, this is the model and it will work with everybody. But yes, that we need to understand that there are some personalities that really don't have a choice, no?
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, Victoria, if we would have run the offsite with this person, which everybody distrust, everybody disliked, it's sort of like, here's the elephant in the room, but nobody will talk about it.
Nobody, they say
It's
there's
like,
no elephant and it's like,
yeah,
as it is, no?
yeah, and I just, it just took somebody like an outsider to come in and tell the CEO and just said, look, you got to get rid of this guy. There's no point getting together as a team and doing some sort of a team engagement, team and building event when you don't have the right players on the team. It doesn't make any sense.
Of course. And what happened afterwards? Did they improve? I mean, did they get? And you told us about the.
Oh yeah, well no. So their scores after this, we did another one. About 5 months later, their scores went up about 25 points across the board.
Wow.
So they weren't quite high performing yet, but they were certainly trending in the right direction. And then maybe 6 or 8 months after that, they got sold for $800 million.
Wow.
So we've got really good results showing that teams can improve dramatically from time 1 to time 2, but if they do the appropriate exercises and stick to their knitting in terms of here's how we need to improve, here's the things we need to work on in order to improve.
What about the challenges that the companies are facing now with this virtual thing? I think of course, this is the main issue in our talk, but I think has to be all together. But how do you think what are the challenges that companies are facing?
Well, when it comes to
virtual team or groups, or building them.
Yeah, when it comes to teams, I see some really interesting challenges, and some of this is actually independent of the pandemic, but have gotten much worse because of the pandemic. There was a study done maybe about 3 years ago for Fortune 500 companies in the United States. So the biggest companies in the United States. And they solicited information about their corporate values. Can you just share with us what your corporate values are? So they went to companies like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, various companies, and said, just tell us what your corporate values are. And then they looked at, okay, which ones are the most frequent? Which ones are the most common? And the number one named value across all those companies was integrity. Makes sense. Everybody, they said, hey, one of our values as a company is to have high integrity. Number 2 was teamwork. So every organization, even before the pandemic, every organization virtually said, teamwork and collaboration are critical to our success. All right. So every organization wants teamwork. But then you get beyond that, you start getting some pretty interesting findings. So first of all, companies have no idea how many teams are in their organizations. My hunch is if I go to the participants and ask them, how many companies, if it's your clients that you serve, if there's a big client you serve, or you're in a company, how many teams are in those organizations? Most companies know how many employees they have. They know what their stock price is. They know what their revenues are, but they have no idea how many teams they have. Which many times you don't even know who to go to in the company about who's in charge of teams. We know who's in charge of learning and development. We know who's in charge of talent acquisition. We know who's in charge of compensation. Okay, who's in charge of effective teamwork? Nobody is. And so when I think about, and so what ends up happening is just kind of a rule of thumb people can use to estimate the number of teams in an organization is multiply the number of employees times 0.2. So if you had 10,000 employees in the company, you probably have 2,000 teams. Then a question I ask is, well, out of those 2,000 teams, what percentage would you estimate to be high performing? And, across the globe, as I've asked this question, most people would settle in on, 10 to 20%. They would say, at best, 20% of our teams are high performing. And that's very consistent with the research that have been done by a couple of different entities. most teams are not high performing. Now, so it's really interesting. So organizations are made up of dozens, if not thousands of teams. Every organization wants teamwork, yet only 1 in 5 is high performing. You go, okay, so why is that? Why is that? Well, one is, I think people don't understand how to build teams. As I said earlier, there's different models about building. Most leaders have no idea how to build a team. They don't have a model, like the rocket model. The second piece, which is just as problematic, is like we see on this page, most leaders don't get feedback on team dynamics and performance. So I said only 1 in 5 teams are high performing. Virtually every team leader, when you ask that question, believes that their team is the 1 in the 5 that's high performing. My team is high performing. The rest of your teams are not, but mine is. Most leaders grossly overestimate the extent to which their teams are high performing. Every leader I talk to thinks they lead a high performing team. And then when we ask the rest of the team how they're doing, you see results that look like this. And no, you're not really leading a high performing team. You're kidding yourself. That is the biggest barrier. That, by God, is the biggest barrier. You know, 1, you don't know who to go to. 2, team organizations don't have any kind of common model for building teams. And 3, there's all these people who are leadership legends in their own mind and team challenged in the eyes of others. They think they're great at leadership. They think they're great at building teams, and they're not. And the reason is that we don't give them feedback about how their teams are doing, and we don't equip them with the training and the tools necessary to improve team performance. Those problems only got exacerbated with the pandemic, now that everybody's gone virtual. You know, the fact that we don't have a team model for building teams makes it even more difficult for all those people who are working remotely. The fact that we're not giving teams feedback about, here's how you're doing, guys, let's help, and we're not equipping leaders about how to fix these problems, is only making things worse because of the pandemic.
I always like to have like the golden rules, if there's some, or golden tips.
My 3 big tips for the audience is, if you want to improve teamwork across organizations, either across your clients or the companies that you're with, golden rule number 1 is adopt a model. You know, we talk about the rocket model, but there are other team models out there. You know, there's the Lencioni model, there's the Hackman model, there's Drexler-Sibbitt model. There are different team models out there. Clearly, we're biased towards our own, but there are other models out there. But the big thing is, if you want to improve teamwork across your organization, make sure the organization has adopted a common model for building teams, so everybody's thinking the same thing when it comes to building teams. Secondly, it's really important that leaders get feedback on how their teams are performing. Because I said earlier, most leaders overestimate the extent to which their teams are high performing. And, you know, people are not going to fix a problem until they get feedback that tells them otherwise. You know, they're not going to address any of these team issues like we've got here until some data comes to them and says, hey, look, you got a big problem here. Otherwise, they're going to think, oh yeah, my team's doing great. Yet, if you look at these results, certainly the members of the teams were all talking to each other that, no, we're not working that great. The team leader's seeing something quite different than the rest of the team is seeing. So give leaders and teams feedback about how they're doing. And I think benchmarking feedback like we've got with the rocket model, where and these scores are compared to 2,500 teams across the globe. Now we're seeing, okay, how do we do? And then the last thing is we have to equip leaders in teams on how to improve their scores. So it's one thing to get feedback, but then it's another thing to say, okay, so what do we do to actually improve those scores? What tools do we use? What techniques do we use? What process do we use to improve our context score, or to improve our mission score, improve our talent score? And Victoria and her team, along with Curphy Leadership Solutions, we've got 40 different tools that we've built to help address these different factors, to help leaders build high-performing teams. And you know, we train internal consultants and external consultants on how to diagnose teams and use those tools. We also train team leaders how to use those tools.
We have different questions here. The first one, and the most voted, is a great way to explain something very complex. nature of the task in a team requires a different team behaviors. Managers often distort and end up having meetings, and more meetings. In your research, what is the impact of this distortion? You talk about desertion. How often does this happen?
Okay, so I'm not sure if I exactly followed the question, Rocio. So can you repeat it again? I want to make sure I answer it properly.
Yeah, well, he's talking about having or end up having meetings and more meetings.
Oh, I hate
it.
Oh, yeah. Got it. Okay, so having too many meetings?
And what is the impact of this distortion, and how often does this happen?
Okay, so I think
I'm sorry, if you want to go to the Q&A, Gordy, and you can click it and you can read it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's fine. But so probably a big opportunity for internal and external consultants or leaders is what I call improving their operating rhythm. And by operating rhythm, it has to do with their team meetings. How often does the team meet? What do they talk about? How do they use that time? It is tremendously important to teams, and it is usually just neglected. Most team meetings are really bad. I think it maybe, as some of the questioners said, I've worked in plenty of organizations at the C-suite where people have meetings before the meetings to figure out what's going to be in the main meeting, and then they can't ever decide anything in the meeting, so they have to have meetings afterwards. It's horrible. It's horrible. So one of the activities we have in our toolkit that we use to help teams is, how do you establish a new operating rhythm? And this is part of the norms piece. How do you end up having team meetings that make sense, that make efficient and effective use of people's time? So when people show up, they're ready to talk. The issues that we have to decide on are listed. We've got a clear agenda, and at the end of the meeting, we have a clear set of accountabilities about who is doing what. And we also spend a little bit of time at the end of these meetings talking about what worked and what didn't work in the meeting, so we can use that information to make the next meeting better. But almost all the teams I work with, we almost always work on their operating rhythm because it's usually bad, and they end up just being huge wastes of time for people.
Perfect. The other question that we have here is, Gordon, can you explain more about courage? What kind of behaviors should people in a team show to express this courage? Courage.
Yeah. So courage has to do with two things. It has to do with trust and psychological safety. So we look at trust a little bit differently on a team. We think teams have high levels of trust when everybody on the team thinks everybody else has the right skills. So Rocio can do her bit, Victoria can do her bit, Gordy can do, I feel comfortable she knows what she's doing. I feel comfortable that Victoria knows what she's doing. They feel comfortable they know what I'm doing. So the first piece of trust is what I call ability. Do we have the right skills on the team to get stuff done? The second part is what I call benevolence. And that says Gordy, Victoria, and Rocio are going to do what's right for the team. They're not going to pursue their own selfish agenda. They're going to do what's right for the team or what's right for the organization. And the third piece that you need to have to build trust is what we call the integrity factor. So if Rocio is going to tell me she's going to get something done by Friday, it gets done by Friday. She follows through with commitments. If these are the rules in which we're going to operate, she follows the rules. She doesn't break the rules. And she doesn't leak confidential information. So to me, the first thing you have to do on a team to establish psychological safety is you got to make sure the ability piece is there. Everybody thinks the right skills are there. The benevolence piece is there. Everybody's doing the right thing for the team. And the integrity piece is there. You got to have all three of those. And if you don't, then, because when you talk about psychological safety means, all right, I'm going to talk to Rocio because I think she did this wrong. And I need to give her some feedback about that. Or Rocio's going to talk to me because, Gordy, this got delivered 2 days late and that's unacceptable. I got to have that conversation with you. So psychological safety says we can have that conversation and feel okay about it. But if the trust is not there, you can't have that conversation. If I go to Rocio and think, okay, she's not going to follow through anyway in terms of her integrity, or she's going to talk about this in a bad way to her teammates from a benevolence perspective, or she's not doing it because she's got her own selfish reasons, I'm not going to have that conversation. So you got to have the trust piece first. And the trust takes a while to build. You know, you just don't share, say, personality results. I'm not going to share my MBTI results or my Hogan results for everybody, and all of a sudden we've got team trust. Because we haven't talked about the ability component, we haven't talked about the benevolence component, we haven't talked about the integrity component. Those build over time. The more I work with Rocio, the more I work with Victoria, the more I say, boy, she's got the right sort of skills. Yeah, she's going to do the right thing about the organization, and you know what? She's good for her word. That builds over time. And then we can start having some of these conversations about, well, Gordy, I know you meant to do this, but you know, this is how it came across. Oh, geez, didn't know that. You know, then the psychological safety conversations can happen. So I think, you know, where a lot of teams make mistakes is a lot of times they jump right into these psychological safety conversations, start challenging each other when the trust hasn't been established yet. And that ends up being painful. Nobody wants to be there. So I think that's how I look at the trust and the psychological safety and the courage factor.
Yeah, I agree. I think that without trust, it's very difficult to perform well in a team.
Yeah.
Thank you. The other question that we have is, can you talk more about polite teams get polite results?
This is the biggest problem I see on C-suite teams. So top teams. With top teams, everybody gets along. Everybody gets along fabulous. There's no psychological safety, as we talked about. There's no challenging. Everybody gets along fabulously. And then after the team meeting, people go down to the bar and they bitch at each other about what they did. You know, so in team meetings, everybody's polite. Even though they know there are things wrong that the team is doing or that the organization is doing, but they won't bring it up in a team meeting. They wait again till afterwards. Like I said, they're at the bar with a colleague and then they'll bitch about, well, do you see what Gordy did? I can't believe he did that. They didn't bring it up in the meeting. They talk about it afterwards. And so what you see happening a lot of times is these are teams that, you know, get along well, but they typically don't get great results. They don't get great results. So they kind of bump along, they do okay. And a lot of times what ends up happening, if this is happening at the very top of the organization, many times they engage in what I call silo wars. So even though the head of sales and the head of marketing get along fine in the team meeting, their direct reports are fighting tooth and nail against each other. You know, marketing hates sales, but and all the people underneath them hate each other, don't trust each other. There's no partnership there. But the two people at the top get along fabulously. And the way they show their displeasure with each other is by having their lieutenants fight their battles. So artificial harmony is a big problem, and it's a bigger problem the higher up you go in organizations.
Okay. Perfect, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. What is the most common mistake that team and team leaders make?
Which is the most what now?
Common mistakes.
Common mistakes.
Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest one we talked about earlier, Rocio, it has to do with they think their team's much better than they are. They just think my team's fine. Why do we need to do anything? That to me is the biggest mistake. My advice is, well, if they're that good, let's have their team do the survey and let's just see. Maybe they're not. So to me, the biggest mistake is they overestimate the extent to which their teams are operating as high-performing teams. And they're not showing any kind of vulnerability about, well, let's really look to see, let's get some data. Let's look to see what the science tells us about how well your teams actually are performing. That to me is the biggest mistake, not getting the data. Perfect.
Thank you. We have more questions, but our time's it's 11 already, so I don't like to. Yeah, so we will try to answer these questions individually by email, or yeah, for them to have these answers. I'd like to thank you, Gordon, very much. I appreciate your time, your knowledge, and sharing this with all our participants and attendees. And for all the attendees, I'm going to change to Spanish. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta sesión. Los esperamos a nuestra próxima sesión de entrevista con expertos en un mes. Y quiero hacerles también extensiva la invitación al taller que vamos a llevar a cabo, y lo comentó por ahí Victoria, de Virtual Team Improvement Workshop. Va a llevarse a cabo en junio, son 6 módulos. Y este taller tiene como objetivo poder darles este sistema, las herramientas y las habilidades para que puedan diagnosticar el tema de sus equipos, y pues con esto elevar el desempeño. Entonces, si están interesados, pueden pues contactarnos directamente y que se puedan inscribir a este taller en junio para que puedan implementar todo lo que vimos aquí, el modelo, y pues todo, que conozcan estas herramientas. Thank you, Gordy, for this chat with Victoria.
No, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.